They say betrayal hurts the most when it comes from your own blood. I used to think that was just something people said to sound poetic, like one of those old sayings you hear at funerals or in country songs. But when it happened to me, I realized those words weren't poetry, they were prophecy. My name's Richard Cole, and I'm 63 years old, born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, in a small, two-bedroom house that used to creak every time the wind hit it. My father was a factory worker, my mother a schoolteacher. We weren't poor, but we weren't comfortable either. Everything we had came from calloused hands and long hours. I grew up believing two things. If you work hard, you'll earn your place in this world. And if you love your family, they'll stand by you no matter what. For most of my life, I believed that second part even more than the first. It's funny. You spend years building something, brick by brick with your bare hands. You pour in sweat, sacrifice sleepless nights, and every ounce of trust you have, and then, one day, a single act, a single choice by someone you love, and the whole damn thing collapses like a house of cards. For me, that day came on a Wednesday morning. The sky was gray, the air heavy, the kind of morning where the world feels off balance. I remember sitting at my desk, a cup of cold coffee beside a stack of contracts I hadn't had the heart to read. The phone rang. It was my lawyer, a man I'd known for nearly 20 years. His voice trembled, which wasn't like him. "Richard," he said quietly, "I think you need to come down to the office now." When a lawyer uses that tone, you know it's not about paperwork. I drove through the rain, hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, and I remember thinking, what could possibly go wrong? My company was stable, profitable even. My employees respected me. My son Ethan was taking more responsibility every month. Ethan, he was my pride, my only child, the one I dreamed would carry the torch when I was gone. He was sharp, too sharp sometimes. Always the smartest guy in the room, but I never minded it. I thought that was a strength. I thought he'd take what I built and make it even greater. But that morning, as I sat in my lawyer's office and watched him slide a thick folder across the desk, I realized I'd been wrong about a lot of things. Inside that folder was the end of everything I'd spent 40 years creating. I didn't understand it at first. I flipped through pages, bank statements, contracts, signatures that looked like mine but weren't. And at the bottom of one document was the name Ethan Cole, my son, listed as sole owner of Cole Industries. I blinked. Looked again. My stomach dropped. My lawyer explained it in pieces, his voice slow, cautious. Ethan had filed documents transferring ownership rights while I was on leave after my wife's surgery. He'd convinced the board it was temporary, part of a restructuring strategy, but once the papers were processed, temporary became permanent, and somehow I'd signed off on it, my own signature, forged, clean, professional. You'd think I'd done it myself. I didn't feel anger right away. What I felt was disbelief, a hollow, echoing silence inside my chest. I remember staring at that paper, my name erased, replaced by his, my son's name, the boy I raised to be honest, the man I'd trusted to protect what we built together. My lawyer kept talking, but I couldn't hear him anymore. His words became noise, muffled, distant. All I could think about was the day Ethan was born. I was 31, holding him in my arms for the first time. He was small, pink, and crying his lungs out. I remember whispering to him, "Don't worry, buddy. Your old man's got you. You'll never have to fight the way I did." And now, decades later, that same boy had fought me. And won. When I finally spoke, my voice didn't even sound like mine. "Are you sure this is legal?" I asked. The lawyer looked away. That was all the answer I needed. I walked out into the rain without my coat. I didn't even care, I just kept walking. Down the block, past the parking lot, past the coffee shop Ethan used to visit with me when he was a teenager. Every step felt heavier than the last. And somewhere between the second and third block, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. Ethan hadn't just stolen my company. He'd been planning it for months. Maybe even years. That kind of betrayal doesn't happen overnight. When I got home, I sat in the dark for hours, didn't eat, didn't move. Just stared at the rain on the window and listened to the thunder roll across the city. And you know what hurts the most about betrayal? It's not the act itself. It's the moment you realize it's not a mistake. He didn't trip and fall into greed. He walked into it, eyes open, steady steps, and left me standing in the storm he created. I tried to convince myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe someone forced him. Maybe he was protecting the business from something I didn't know. But deep down, I knew better. Later that night, I drove to his house. It wasn't even my first plan. I just couldn't sit still anymore. The moment he opened the door, I saw it in his eyes, and not guilt, not fear, confidence. He'd already made peace with what he did. That broke me more than anything else. "Dad," he said, his voice calm, almost bored. "I was going to tell you." "Tell me what, Ethan?" "That you stole my company." He sighed. "I didn't steal it. I saved it. You were holding it back. You still think business runs on loyalty and handshakes. It doesn't anymore. It's about leverage. You built something great, but I'm the one who can make it bigger." For a long second, I couldn't breathe. He was standing there, my own son, explaining why betraying me was logical. And in that moment, I saw a stranger where my son used to be. I didn't yell, didn't hit him, didn't break anything. I just looked at him and said, "You'll understand one day what you've done. But by then it'll be too late." He just smirked. "You always say that, Dad, that smirk. That casual arrogance." That was the moment I stopped being his father. People like to say that time heals all wounds. That's a lie. Time doesn't heal betrayal. It just teaches you how to live with it. How to wake up every morning and wear your pain like a coat no one else can see. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Couldn't eat. I'd walk the empty halls of the house Laura and I built. The pictures of Ethan smiling down at me from the walls, each one felt like a ghost. But I'm not telling you this story for sympathy. I'm telling you because that day, the day my world shattered, and was also the day something inside me woke up. I'd spent my whole life playing by the rules. I'd trusted too easily, believed too deeply, and for that I paid the price. But you see, the thing about losing everything is, you've got nothing left to lose, and that makes you dangerous. This isn't a story about an old man who got crushed by betrayal. No, this is a story about how a broken man learned to play the game smarter, how I took the pieces of the life my son destroyed and used them to turn the tables. So if you've ever trusted someone so much that losing them felt like losing a piece of yourself, if you've ever looked in the mirror and wondered how you didn't see it coming, then maybe my story will mean something to you, because when betrayal comes from blood, it doesn't just break you, and it builds you into something else, something colder, something wiser, something unstoppable. They say a man's legacy is built long before anyone knows his name. And I guess that's true, because before Coal Industries ever meant anything to anyone, it was just me, a beat-up pickup truck, and a dream too stubborn to die. I started Coal Industries in the spring of 1987, right there in Cincinnati, Ohio. Back then, the economy was unpredictable. One month you'd be swimming, the next you'd be gasping for air. But I didn't care. I was young, hungry, and too foolish to think about failure. All I had was a small garage I rented behind an old warehouse and a few machines that looked like they'd survived the war. I remember the smell of grease and iron filling the air, the echo of metal clanging like music to my ears. Those sounds were my heartbeat back then. People laughed when I told them I wanted to build a machinery supply business. Too many competitors, they said. You'll never make it. But I'd grown up hearing no all my life, from teachers, bosses, even relatives. So I got used to turning no into motivation. In those early days, I did everything myself. I was the salesman, the delivery guy, the accountant, and the janitor. I'd wake up at 4 a.m, load the truck, drive across the city delivering parts, and come back late at night to clean up the workshop. I'd spend hours cold calling potential clients from a payphone, pretending Coal Industries was a big firm when it was really just me and a couple of machines. Sometimes I'd come home so tired I couldn't even untie my boots. I'd just sit there on the porch steps, staring into the darkness, wondering if all that effort would ever mean anything. And that's when Laura would come out. My wife. My rock. She'd hand me a cup of coffee, not because I needed the caffeine, but because she knew I needed the reminder that someone believed in me. "Richard," she'd say softly, sitting beside me, You've got something the rest of them don't, you don't quit. And she was right. I didn't quit. Laura and I built that business together, in our own ways. She handled the books, kept track of invoices, made sure the bills got paid when clients didn't. There were months we barely scraped by, weeks when we couldn't afford to replace a broken machine, when I had to choose between paying rent or buying new equipment, but somehow, we always made it work. Our evenings were simple back then. Cheap takeout, laughter over spilled coffee, and dreams too big for our small kitchen table. I still remember the night we came up with the company's slogan, built on trust. Laura said it out loud first. She smiled, leaned back in her chair and said, "Because that's who you are, Richard. You'd rather lose a deal than lose your integrity." That line stuck, and so did the meaning behind it. Every customer who walked through my doors wasn't just a client. They were someone I owed honesty to. That principle became the backbone of everything that followed. By the early 2000s, Coal Industries was no longer a one-man show. We had 20 employees, 3 warehouses, and contracts with some of the biggest construction companies in the Midwest. I'd walk into the office every morning to the sound of phones ringing, forklifts humming, and people actually wanting to be there. That feeling, seeing something you built with your bare hands grow into something real, it's hard to describe. It wasn't just a company anymore. It was a family. And then, in 1998, when our son Ethan turned 10, I brought him to the warehouse for the first time. I remember that day like it was yesterday. He stood there, wide-eyed, staring at the rows of machines, the workers moving in rhythm, the energy of it all. "Dad," he said, "you built all this?" I laughed. "Not alone, buddy, but yeah. Your old man had something to do with it." He smiled, the kind of smile that makes your heart swell. Right then I knew. One day this would all be his. As Ethan grew, I made sure he didn't get spoiled. He worked summers at the company, sweeping floors, running errands, cleaning out storage rooms. I remember one time, he came home furious because a foreman yelled at him for dropping a part box. He stormed into the house, threw his gloves down and said, "You're the boss. Why do I have to do that kind of work?" I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Because you're my son. That means you work twice as hard as everyone else. You don't get a free pass. You earn your place." He didn't like it at the time, but I wanted him to understand what I'd learned the hard way. Respect doesn't come from a name. It comes from effort, and for a while, I thought he got it. Years passed. He graduated college, top of his class in business administration. Laura cried at his ceremony. I stood there, chest out, proud as hell. After that, I brought him into the company full-time, started him off small, assistant manager, under a supervisor who didn't care that he was the boss's son. I wanted him to learn everything from the ground up, how to deal with suppliers, how to talk to clients, how to manage workers who'd seen it all. He was good, too good. Maybe Ethan had a way with people. Smooth talker, confident, sharp as a blade. He could walk into a meeting and make anyone believe in him. But there was something about the way he looked at things, numbers, profits, growth, that sometimes made me uneasy. He once said, "Dad, loyalty's good, but it doesn't pay the bills." I laughed it off at the time. But I should have paid attention, because behind that charm was ambition, and ambition without empathy can be deadly. Coal Industries kept growing. By the time Ethan turned 25, we were on the national map. We supplied heavy machinery and industrial components to half the states in the Midwest. I remember seeing our logo, that simple C, with the bold letters underneath, painted on trucks and crates across construction sites. It was more than a symbol. It was proof that I'd made it. I thought we had everything a man could ask for. A thriving business, a good family, a future secured. But if I've learned anything in this life, it's that success blinds you. When everything's going right, you stop looking for cracks, and that's when they start forming. Ethan started taking more control around that time. He was tech-savvy, quick with modern systems, knew how to speak the language of younger clients. He said the world was changing, and we needed to change with it. He brought in consultants, started restructuring departments, talking about modernization and digital transformation. I didn't understand half of it, but I trusted him. I figured he's my son. He's got fresh ideas. Maybe it's time to let the next generation lead. What I didn't realize was that while I was teaching him everything about running a business, he was watching me just as closely, not to follow my footsteps, but to see where I was vulnerable. It's strange thinking back. There were little signs, here and there, that I brushed aside. One day, an old employee named Harold, been with me since the early days, came into my office looking uneasy. "Boss," he said, "your boy's been making moves behind the scenes. Changing contracts, bringing in new partners without looping anyone in." I laughed it off. "Come on, Harold. He's just trying to improve things." "Don't worry so much," he hesitated. "You're the boss, just keep your eyes open." I should have listened, but I was blinded by pride, the kind only a father feels when he looks at his son and sees a reflection of everything he's worked for. Couldn't imagine Ethan doing anything that would hurt me. I thought we were a team, father and son side by side, building something that would last generations. But you see, I didn't understand something crucial back then. When you teach someone everything you know, you also teach them how to defeat you. Ethan learned the trade, the tricks, the patience it takes to win a deal. He learned how to read people, their tones, their fears, their weaknesses. He learned how to play the long game, and while I thought I was shaping him into a leader, he was shaping himself into a strategist who would one day see me not as his father, but as his obstacle. Looking back, I can still picture that younger version of myself, standing in the factory yard after closing hours, watching the sunset hit the steel beams of the warehouse, the smell of oil and dust in the air, the hum of machines dying down. That place and that moment yet was everything to me. It wasn't just a business. It was my life's proof that hard work and honesty could still win in a world full of shortcuts. And if someone had told me then that the person who'd destroy it all would be the boy, whose first steps I cheered for, whose first paycheck I signed, whose name I dreamed of putting beside mine on the company sign, I would have laughed them out of the room. But life has a cruel sense of irony. The same foundation I built with love, sweat, and loyalty was the same foundation my son would one day use to bury me alive in my own creation. You know, people like to talk about betrayal as if it happens in one clean, dramatic moment, a single sharp stab in the back. But in real life, it creeps up on you slow. It starts as whispers, half glances, little things that don't quite add up. You tell yourself you're imagining it, until the truth hits you so hard you can't breathe. That's how it began for me. At first, it was small stuff. Ethan missing early meetings, brushing off suppliers I'd worked with for years. I'd walk into the office, the same office I'd built from the ground up, and catch a few of my senior staff exchanging quick looks when I passed. I'd ask what was going on, and they'd plaster on fake smiles, pretending everything was fine. But I could feel something off. You can always sense it when your world starts to shift beneath you, like a machine starting to rattle before it breaks. Still, I didn't want to believe it. After all, this was my son, my pride, my legacy, the boy I'd carried on my shoulders when he was little, who used to call me his hero, so I brushed it all off. Told myself he's just young, trying new ideas. Maybe I'm the one being stubborn. But then came that morning, the one that changed everything. It was a Thursday, cold and gray. I remember because I was sipping black coffee by the window of my office when my accountant, Mark, knocked on the door. He looked nervous. The man's been with me for 20 years. I'd seen him handle million-dollar audits without blinking. But that day his hands were trembling. "Richard," he said quietly, "you might want to sit down." I frowned. "What's this about, Mark?" He hesitated, then placed a folder on my desk. Inside were pages of bank statements, transaction logs, and wire transfers I didn't recognize. "Withdrawals," he said. "Large ones. Moved through shell accounts, all under Coal Industries." I felt a chill crawl up my neck. "Who authorized these?" Mark didn't answer. He just turned one page toward me, and there it was. The signature, Ethan Cole. My own son. I remember staring at that signature for what felt like hours, my chest tightening with each breath. I wanted to believe it was some kind of mistake, a forgery, a hacker, anything but him. But Mark had already done his homework. The accounts led back to subsidiaries I didn't even know we had. New contracts had been drawn up, but they weren't filed through my approval process. Ethan had been setting up back channels, funneling money, cutting side deals, and all behind my back. When I finally spoke, my voice didn't sound like mine. "Since when?" "About a year," Mark whispered. "Maybe longer, a year." My son had been betraying me for a full year, smiling across the dinner table, shaking my hand at meetings, calling me dad, all while stabbing me in the back. That night, I waited for him at home. Laura was out visiting her sister, so it was just me, the quiet of our living room, and the ticking of the old wall clock. Every second sounded louder, sharper, like the world itself was counting down to something ugly. When Ethan finally walked in, wearing that confident grin he'd inherited from me, I felt my blood boil. "Sit down," I said. He frowned, tossed his keys on the counter. "What's this about?" I threw the folder onto the coffee table. "You tell me." He flipped through the pages, not even pretending to be shocked. Then he looked up, calm, composed, almost bored. "Dad," he said, "the world's changing. You're stuck in the past. I'm just doing what needs to be done." For a second, I thought I misheard him. "What needs to be done?" I repeated, my voice trembling. "You stole from your own father, from the company your mother and I built." He sighed. "I didn't steal. I restructured. You wouldn't let me take risks, so I did it myself. You still think it's 1995, but business doesn't work like that anymore. You're holding us back." That word, us. Like I wasn't part of it anymore. "Ethan," I said quietly, "I gave you everything. You think I built this company so you could tear it down in the name of progress?" He laughed. "No, Dad. I'm building it up. You just can't see it." And with that, he turned and walked out, calm as ever, leaving me sitting there, heart pounding, staring at the door like it was the last time I'd see him as my son. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there in the dark, watching the city lights flicker through the window, thinking about every sacrifice I'd made, the nights I'd spent in the factory fixing broken machines while he slept warm at home, the years I missed birthdays and anniversaries, so he could have a better future. And now that same boy looked me in the eye and told me I was the problem. Hit me harder than any loss I'd ever faced. Not just the betrayal, but the realization that somewhere along the way, I'd raised a stranger, for the first time in decades. I felt old, not just tired, obsolete. The company I built, the son I loved, the legacy I thought I could trust, it was all slipping through my fingers. And as I sat there, with the weight of 63 years pressing on my chest, one thought kept echoing in my mind like a storm rolling in from the distance. If he thinks I'm done, he has no idea who he's dealing with. They say when the ground finally gives way beneath you, it doesn't make a sound. It just disappears, leaving you gasping in the fall. That's exactly what it felt like. I didn't see it coming, not really. There were warning signs, sure, whispers in the halls, the shift in people's tone when I walked by, the sudden silence in meetings when I entered the room. But I told myself it would blow over. That family loyalty and legacy still meant something. Turns out, I was dead wrong. It happened 3 months after that confrontation with Ethan. 3 long months where I tried to keep things steady, to pretend that nothing was broken, that maybe, just maybe, my son would come to his senses. I showed up every morning, shook hands, smiled through meetings, while the people around me pretended not to see the cracks forming under my feet. But behind those polished glass walls of Coal Industries, something dark was brewing, something I didn't yet understand. It started with a rumor. A supplier I'd worked with for years called me one morning. "Richard," he said carefully, "is everything okay over there?" "Of course," I replied. "Why?" He hesitated. "Well, your son, Ethan, he told us you're stepping down soon, said your health's not what it used to be." For a moment I just froze. He said what? "Look, I didn't believe him," the supplier continued. "But people talk, you know. There's been some chatter in the trade circles. Articles floating around about you maybe taking early retirement. For medical reasons. Medical reasons? Retirement?" I felt my stomach twist. That's when I realized Ethan wasn't just trying to push new business strategies, and he was rewriting my story. A week later, the first article dropped. "Is the king of coal industries losing his edge?" It was a hit piece, written like a puff piece but laced with poison between the lines. It talked about anonymous sources claiming I'd been forgetful, erratic, difficult in meetings. that I was clinging to power despite obvious signs of burnout. I remember sitting in my office reading that garbage on my phone, hands shaking so hard I could barely hold it. My wife Laura tried to calm me down, but I could barely hear her. That article wasn't just random gossip, it was strategic. The kind of move that only someone close to me could make, someone who knew my weaknesses, someone like Ethan. Within days, things escalated. Board members who used to greet me with respect now kept their distance. My calls started going unanswered. Projects I'd signed off on were put on hold without explanation. Ethan, meanwhile, was everywhere, taking calls, giving press statements, smiling that confident, polished smile that looked so much like mine once did. I could see what was happening, but I couldn't stop it. He was isolating me, step by step, piece by piece, from the very company I built. Then came the email. Emergency board meeting. Attendance required. The message was short, cold, no explanation. Just a time and place, Monday, 9 a.m. I didn't sleep the night before. My gut told me what was coming, but a small part of me still hoped there'd been a misunderstanding, that maybe this was just a restructuring discussion, a tough business call. But when I walked into that conference room, I knew immediately. They were all there, the entire board, dressed sharp and silent. The air felt heavy. Ethan sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, his laptop open, face calm, hands folded. The chairman cleared his throat. "Richard," he said, "we need to discuss the direction of coal industries." I forced a smile. "Direction?" I thought we had a good one. He didn't smile back. "Concerns have been raised, serious concerns, yeah, about your ability to lead effectively." My pulse spiked. "Concerns? What the hell are you talking about?" The chairman slid a folder toward me. Reports, emails, signed statements. In them, I was portrayed as a paranoid old man, volatile, unstable, unfit. Emails supposedly from me to clients, filled with rants and bizarre accusations, except I'd never written a single one. I looked up straight at Ethan. He didn't flinch, didn't even blink. "Dad?" he said softly, like he was doing me a favor. "Maybe it's time you took a break. For your health," my voice cracked. "My health?" He leaned back in his chair, relaxed, composed. "You've done great things, but maybe it's time to pass the torch. Let the next generation take over." That phrase, "pass the torch," felt like a knife twisting in my gut. For decades, I'd dreamed of one day handing him the company with pride. Not like this. Not through deceit, lies, and backstabbing. When the vote came, I knew it was over before it began, 7 in favor. 1 against. I'd been voted out, removed from my own company. And the one who led the charge? My son, my flesh and blood, Ethan Cole. As I walked out of that boardroom, the place I'd spent more of my life in than my own home, I felt hollow. The world outside looked the same. Cars moving, people chatting, life going on, but mine had stopped. I turned back one last time, just as Ethan stood at the head of the table shaking hands, smiling for the board members like a man who'd just won something monumental. And then, for a brief moment, our eyes met. He didn't look ashamed. He didn't look sorry. He looked satisfied. That was the moment I knew Richard Cole, the proud founder, the builder, the dreamer, was gone. But something else took his place that day. Something sharper, colder. A will I didn't know I still had. A hunger to make things right. Not for revenge, but for justice. For the truth. They thought they'd buried me. They didn't realize they'd just planted the seed of something far more dangerous. Because the moment I walked out of that building, I made myself a silent promise. I may have lost my company, my name, and my pride, but I won't lose the fight. That was the day my story of revenge truly began. When the ground gives out beneath your feet, everything that was solid in your life starts to act like it never was. You look for places to grab onto and there's nothing. Just air and the echo of your own breath. That's how those weeks felt after the board voted me out. Like falling over and over and never hitting the ground. In less than a month, I watched the things I'd built for 40 years disappear like footprints in a storm. Coal Industries, my pride and my stubborn heart, was stripped from me piece by piece. Contracts I'd negotiated personally were voided. Accounts were frozen. The bank, friends I thought were friends, tightened their lines. Investors I'd eaten with and laughed with in back rooms suddenly found reasons to distance themselves. I got calls from lawyers, collection agencies, and a handful of people with voices that used to hold respect, now thin with caution. They asked me questions I didn't want to answer. "Are you okay, Richard?" They'd say, as if the right answer could stitch a wound like that closed. I lost money. Real cold numbers on a statement that made things I'd once considered permanent dissolve. Savings vanished into legal fees, buyout clauses, and settlements. The house that felt like home turned into a set of rooms full of silence. Laura took long drives to see her sister, and the empty chair at the kitchen table felt louder than any city siren. But losing money was almost manageable. What I could not stomach was the way people looked at me. The firm handshake turned into a nod across the street. The neighbor who'd once asked me to help with his leaky roof now pretended my passing was a coincidence. Pride is a funny thing, until it becomes public, and then it's something everyone feels comfortable stomping on. The first week I tried to stay. I went to the places I'd always gone, the warehouse, the factory floor, the old office. Every familiar sound felt distorted. Machines hummed the same, but they felt foreign. The receptionist avoided eye contact. Employees whispered and then looked at me like I was a ghost. When I stood in the doorway of the main bay, people pretended not to notice. That's a special kind of pain you don't get in stories. The slow erasure of your presence where you used to be the center of everything. Laura said I needed to rest. "Go somewhere quiet," she said. "Clear your head. You're not thinking straight." The truth was I was thinking too straight. The silence was loud with plans I didn't want to voice. There are thoughts that you don't admit because saying them out loud makes them real. So I put some clothes in an old duffel, kissed her forehead like I'd been doing for 40 years, and left before dawn. I rented a small cabin about an hour outside the city, past the strip malls and commuter traffic where the land finally starts to breathe. The cabin was nothing fancy, a single room with a wood stove, a sink, and one window that looked out over a thicket of maples. The kind of place people go to find themselves when life's noise gets too loud. For me, it was the only place where people couldn't watch me fall apart. At first, the days were empty and heavy. I'd chop wood until my hands blistered and then stare at the stove until it felt like my memories might ignite. I drank coffee so bitter it could peel paint. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, one meal that all tasted like ash. The phone stayed silent most of the time. When it rang, it was usually another creditor or someone who'd once smiled easily at the sight of me asking for favors I no longer could grant. Nights were the worst. In the dark, every memory stretched out like a film reel. Laura's laughter in the kitchen, the first time I drove the truck full of parts into a job site, and the foreman clapped me on the back. Ethan's small hand in mine as he learned to walk past a stack of crates. I would tumble through those scenes and wake up with the taste of metal in my mouth, a nauseous combination of grief and anger. But anger is a fuel of a different kind. It's messy and dangerous if you don't control it, but it keeps you moving. And movement became my anchor. Every night I replayed conversations with Ethan, line by line, promise by promise. I remember small things, the way he used to lean in when I gave advice, how he'd echo phrases I'd used around the shop, how he'd roll his eyes at a supplier's stories and then call them 5 minutes later, softer and smoother. I'd sit with each memory and pick at it, looking for seams, where the real folded into the acted. I collected the little oddities and realized they added up. He hadn't just taken a company. He'd taken something no accountant could measure, my trust. Trust is an odd currency. You can't put it in a ledger. You can't freeze it in an account. But when it's gone, everything else feels counterfeit. Money can be replaced. A building can be bought again. But a broken trust is heavier than any debt. As the days turned into weeks, my mind sharpened. You'd think losing everything would dull a man, make him small and quiet. For some, maybe. For me, it did the opposite. The loss burned something out of me that used to be soft. Maybe it was naivete. Maybe it was a belief that people are better than they show. Whatever it was, the heat of that realization forged something new. I started cataloging facts. I made lists on cheap notebook paper. Names, dates, invoice numbers, off-the-books transfers. I had the legal documents the board used to boot me. I kept copies after the hearing, like a man clutching splinters of his own life. Those papers were a roadmap if you knew how to read them. I started quietly reaching out to old friends. Not the ones who deserted me, but the ones who'd left on principle when long before Ethan rewired the company. Harold, the old foreman, answered first. He'd always been blunt. The kind of man who'd say what most keep quiet. When I told him I was in the area, he drove down with 2 cups of bad diner coffee and sat across from me on the cabin porch. "You look like hell, boss," he said, and I could have laughed if not for the dryness in my throat. He handed me the coffee and didn't bother with small talk. "What's the play?" he asked. He'd been there when we built the first warehouse. He'd seen the grease on my hands. He'd also been there when Ethan started shaking up the payroll. He'd noticed the new accounts and the men Ethan brought in, slick, younger faces who knew how to smile at shareholders and never once lifted a wrench. I told Harold what I'd been doing, writing down names, keeping records, watching patterns. "You think you can do anything about it?" he asked. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I know this. The people who cut ties with me did so because they were scared. Scared of the new crowd Ethan brought in. Scared of what would happen if they spoke up. Scared for a paycheck. Fear's a tool, greed's another. And Ethan's been feeding both. That line, it stuck with me. The thought flickered in the dark one night. Use his greed against him. People like Ethan, sharp, hungry, build empires on the assumption that no one will fight back. They assume people will take the easy route, follow the new shiny plan because it promises profit. But greed makes people reckless, and reckless makes them sloppy. Everyone has a weak seam if you tug the right way. So I started pulling, not in the dramatic way you see in movies. No late-night phone calls to shadowy figures or high-stakes confrontations. I moved quietly, methodically. I called in favors that had been earned, not begged for. I reached out to clients who had felt used by Ethan's quick deals and short promises. Some answers were cold. Some doors closed. But a few opened. Old partners who'd left told me about contracts Ethan had fast-tracked, vendors who'd been paid off the books, and a supplier that had been promised exclusive rights in exchange for a fat upfront payment. Those stories lined up and the lines connected into the bigger picture. Ethan's deals were not just questionable, they were combustible. Meanwhile, I read corporate filings, the kind of dry, boring legalese most people snooze through, and found details that didn't add up. A subsidiary that had no office, a shell company registered under a different name, payments routed through middlemen. I learned how to follow a trail of money, how to translate euphemisms in emails into hard facts. I was surprised at how quickly my old instincts returned. The same patience that built a business was good at seeing patterns other people missed. There were nights I wanted to call Ethan and shout until my voice broke. To tell him the names I'd written down, the ways he'd betrayed me. But every time I almost reached for the phone, I stopped. Anger, I'd learned, clouds the best plans. If I was going to turn this around, it would be with a cool head and a map, not a fist. On a cold morning 2 months in, after another night of chopping wood until my arms ached, I sat at a little table and spread out a stack of notes. I put a mark next to each name that had a thread going back to Ethan. I circled a few that had the telltale signs of greed. Vendors who'd been promised exclusive contracts, board members who had been promised positions in new partnerships. They had motives, and motives are windows. That was the moment the plan began. Not the flashy kind, but the careful kind. I wasn't thinking of grand revenge. I was thinking of leverage, of truth. If greed had been Ethan's engine, I would wedge myself into the gears and make the engine stall. People think revenge is about retribution. In my case, it was about reclamation. Reclaiming my name, my dignity, the truth. I wanted to show the world what had really happened, and to make sure Ethan faced the consequences of the path he chose. Not because I wanted him broken, but because the world needed to know the price of betrayal when it wears your face. So I chopped more wood. I drank more coffee. I wrote more names. I called more people who had nothing left to lose. And for the first time since the boardroom closed on me, I felt something that wasn't fear. I felt the slow building of a counterattack, patient, quiet, and driven by a clarity I hadn't felt in years. They'd taken everything. Fine. I still had my hands, my head, and a little cabin in the country. And with those, I intended to build something they couldn't easily stomp on. The truth. Revenge isn't a scream. It isn't fireworks and yelling on a midnight highway. Revenge, the kind that sticks and actually changes things, is a slow chess match. It's patience. It's reading the other player, predicting their moves, and then quietly rearranging the board so they run headfirst into your trap. That's what I learned in that cabin with a wood stove and a stack of notebooks. Anger lights the match. But strategy wins the war after the fall. I had two things people who betray others rarely prepare for: time and the humility that comes with having nothing left to lose. Time let me breathe. It let me look at the mess Ethan made from a distance and actually see it. Humility kept me honest. When you're stripped of pride, you stop pretending. You start naming things clearly. Greed, deception, patterns. First thing I did was go back to the people. Not to shout or plead, to listen. I reached out to a handful of old partners who had left coal industries in the months leading up to the board coup. Some I called, some I drove to see. You'd be surprised what long lunches and bad coffee will reveal when two men both feel wronged. There was Harold, the foreman, who'd been with me since the old days, the man who knew which supplier would short us aluminum in winter and who'd personally taught me how to weld a corner so it held. Harold was blunt. "You got played, boss," he said, not unkindly. They came in fast, offering money, promises, positions. Ethan cut corners I'd never let happen. People who trusted him got left holding invoices. Then there was Maria, a supplier from Dayton who'd trusted coal with early payments during boom years. She told me in a small diner, hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup, that Ethan promised exclusivity to a newer, flashier partner. "He sweet-talked me," she said. "Said I'd be on the inside if I moved fast. I did." Then he sold me out. She slid across a photocopy of a contract, signatures, dates, and a clause that smelled like fraud. Piece by piece, their testimonies wove together. The common thread was the same. Ethan had used short-term gains and sweetheart deals to build quick momentum. He rewarded loyalty only until he didn't need it, then cut ties fast. Promises were made and broken. People felt used. And when people feel used, they whisper. Whispers become leaks. Leaks become evidence. I didn't start by shouting those whispers from the rooftops. That would have been amateur hour. Instead, I planted a different narrative. I told these people I was starting something new. Not Coal 2.0, not a vengeance company. A quiet venture built on the things I believed in. Transparency, real contracts, and treating suppliers like partners instead of collateral. The phrasing mattered. People wanted distance from drama, not a front row seat. "Keep it quiet," I told each one. "We'll build slow. We'll do right. No flashy headlines." They believed me because I'd built a reputation on honesty once, and scars are better teachers than glossy promises. Next, I needed hard proof. Stories and anger will move a crowd, but they don't move regulators or judges. So I became boring in the best possible way. I followed paper. Money, when you look hard enough, leaves footprints. I taught myself to read them again. It's amazing how competent you can be when you're driven by a very personal fire. I started with the documents I'd kept after the board meeting, the ones they'd handed me like evidence of my supposed incompetence. In those pages there were clues Ethan had overlooked. An email chain missing a CC, a contract with an odd routing clause, a payment that went through 2 intermediary accounts before landing in a vendor's hands. Those detours are the fingerprint of someone trying to obscure a trail. They were sloppy in places, arrogant in others, as if they thought my age made me blind to the obvious. From the cabin, I coordinated quiet audits. I reached out to friends in the industry who owed me favors, people I'd helped in the past, men and women who'd seen the same greed in their own back rooms. One by one, they checked files, corroborated dates, and pulled phone records. I found emails Ethan sent late at night promising exclusivity in exchange for upfront payments. I found invoices that matched no deliveries. I found a shell company that existed only on paper, its registration routed through a third state and a lawyer who'd never met our company. Evidence like this is delicate. You don't fling it into the wind and hope the storm does your work. You gather it. You catalog it. You make it undeniable. So I scanned everything, made copies, and created a secure stash of documents. Names, dates, amounts, phone numbers. Every scrap that showed intent, not accident. Intent is what prosecutors look for. Not the face of a greedy kid chasing quick wins, but the careful building of a scheme. That's when the slow recruiting really began. I didn't want people out of bitterness. I wanted them out of principle. So I approached candidates with respect. You were wronged, I'd say. You have a choice to make about what happens next. Some turned me down, fearful, tired, or stoic in their new life. A few, though, looked like they'd been waiting for permission to speak. They told me about contracts Ethan had promised and then sold to offshore buyers. about half-built projects abandoned after quick profit was booked, about staff cut without warning. The stories were ugly, but predictable in their pattern. Greed leaves the same footprints everywhere. With allies in place, I did something counterintuitive. I didn't attack. I set up a lean operation modeled after a small consultancy. We called it Nothing Flashy at first. A little firm that provided legitimacy checks and compliance reviews. It was the perfect cover. We were a group of former insiders with the combined dirt and documentation to make a case, without sounding like bitter exiles. While we built credibility, I fed selective quiet pressure in places where it would matter. An anonymous tip here to a journalist known for digging into corporate fraud. A carefully worded inquiry to a supplier threatened by exclusive clauses. A background call to a compliance officer at a bank handling suspicious transactions. None of it was illegal. It was simply the right push in the right places. I matched facts to the people who could act on them. This is where patience paid off. The important players, the board members who had switched sides for a quick seat at the new table, loved being asked about. Their due diligence, they responded with the kind of defensiveness that looks like guilt when you pair it with evidence. One of them, a man I'd trusted for 15 years, started answering phone calls with a new politeness. He wanted distance from headlines. I could see the calculations in his eyes. He'd taken a gamble for gain, and now the gains might come with real penalties. There's a moral line I didn't cross. I didn't lie. I didn't fabricate. And I didn't try to coerce. I only gave facts to those who could use them in official ways. Because truth has a way of compacting into consequences when you place it in the right hands. And then, there was the human chess. I showed my new team how to speak to Ethan's partners, the men who'd been promised lofty roles and quick profit. We painted pictures of stability and long-term value. We can help you secure your claims, I'd say. But if you want to keep your reputation and avoid public scrutiny, you should hear us out. Greed, when matched with a threat to reputation, becomes suddenly pliable. People who will throw their loyalties to the highest bidder will also protect their names when the price of association gets high. We also started leveraging the simplest form of power, credibility. I reached out to a few small-time journalists I knew to be fair-minded. I gave them a palette of verifiable facts and suggested they look at a pattern. Good reporters hate being fed a narrative. They love being given a lead. The result was inevitable. The first small article hit a niche trade newsletter, a careful piece about unusual payment routes and shell entities, written without drama, but with teeth. The right people read it. Regulators took notice. Curiosity turned into questions. I didn't want Ethan to see most of this. He was arrogant, yes, but also quick to act when threatened, so I operated in the shadow he thought he cast. In board games, you bait the opponent where you want him, and then you pull away the piece he expects to use. I was the disappearing rook. Finally, I set the dinner. It wasn't a trap in the cheap movie sense with ropes and hidden microphones. It was surgical. I invited Ethan under the guise of reconciliation. I wanted his reaction in a private room, on camera, no, but with witnesses whose statements could be called to account later if needed. I wanted him to know I was not the broken old man he painted me to be. I wanted him to feel the pressure of being confronted with facts that wouldn't let him charm his way out. The dinner invitation sounded almost foolish. We should talk, I wrote in a careful email, the kind I knew would get read. I said nothing about documents or allegations. I kept it light. Just father and son. Just dinner. He accepted with the ease of a man who thinks he still controls the script. Between the cabin and that evening, I put the final pieces together. I had backups of everything. Copies in safety deposit boxes, digital files with encrypted passwords shared only with those who had already committed. I had a legal team on standby, not to start a war right then, but to be ready if prosecutors called or if I needed to file formal complaints. I didn't want to look like a man swinging at ghosts. I wanted to present a case clean enough that the law would do the work I couldn't. The plan was not to humiliate him publicly at dinner. It was to make him comfortable, to let him talk, to watch how he reacted when the past he'd tried to bury was put on the table. People who run on impulse will give themselves away in small moments. The tightening of a jaw, a shift in posture, that brief pause before a practiced lie. You can read a man better over a plate of roast than in a courtroom transcript. That night, As I stacked the last of the papers in a leather folder and dressed in a suit that still fit better than I thought it would, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: control. Not over the company, I had none, but over my story. I had moved from being the subject of other people's narratives to someone capable of shaping truth with facts and patience. The board had taken my title, my savings had been nicked, and my name had been smeared. But they hadn't taken the one thing they couldn't: the right to tell the truth. So I drove into the city to meet my son, folder in the passenger seat, a quiet plan humming behind my chest. Outside, the lights of the highway smeared into lines, and for the first time since the vote, I didn't feel like a man being carried by the current. I felt like the current itself. And somewhere between the cabin and the restaurant, I rehearsed my lines like a man practicing for a play where every scene decides the next act of his life. This wasn't about vengeance in the moment. It was about setting a chain in motion, properly, legally, and with the slow relentlessness of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. He walked into that restaurant like he owned the world. Head high, steps confident, shoulders squared, the same arrogant poise I'd once mistaken for leadership. Ethan had always carried himself like he was born for bigger things, even when he was just a boy stacking wooden blocks in my office. But that night his confidence felt different, colder. He moved like a man who'd already buried his past, like the ghost of everything I built was just another number in his portfolio. He wore a navy, tailored suit, probably Armani, and an expensive watch glinting under the chandelier light. My watch, the one I gave him on his graduation day. I remember that moment like it was yesterday. He was 22, full of dreams, smiling with pride as I clasped the band around his wrist. "You earned this," I told him then. "Every second of your time is worth something." Now, staring at it again across the linen-covered table, I realized he'd twisted that lesson into something darker, that to him worth was measured in control, not character. "Dad," he said with that infuriating smirk, half charm, half dismissal, "didn't expect to hear from you. Thought you were taking time off." The arrogance was effortless. "A performance," I smiled politely. The way a snake charmer smiles at his cobra. "I figured you might want to know how your old man's doing," I replied, my tone even. "Practiced." The waiter came by, polite, oblivious. We ordered coffee. I didn't trust myself with anything stronger. The small talk came first, as expected. Meaningless chatter about the economy, the market, politics, all the nonsense people hide behind when the truth between them is too heavy to touch. He told me about new contracts, international expansions, how coal industries was thriving under fresh leadership. Every word was rehearsed, like he was giving an investor pitch, not talking to his father. I nodded. Let him talk, let him bask in his illusion. Because the thing about arrogance is, it blinds you. It makes you forget that sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one holding the detonator. When the waiter left and the plates were cleared, I placed my hand on the folder sitting beside me. Leather-bound, simple, unassuming. Years of patience and pain compressed into 30 pages. I looked him dead in the eye. "You know," I began slowly, "I used to think betrayal was an accident, something people fall into when they lose their way. But you planned yours. You studied me, learned my habits, my trust, my flaws. You used them all like chess pieces." Ethan's smile faded just a little, but he didn't speak. He leaned back, fingers tapping the table in that old rhythm, a habit he had when he was nervous as a kid. "I don't know what you're talking about," he finally said, his tone sharp but uncertain. "Oh, I think you do." I slid the folder across the table, slow enough for him to feel the weight of it before he even touched it. The sound of it hitting the polished wood was louder than I expected. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside were copies of contracts, financial trails, forged documents, and a few carefully highlighted pages, evidence that proved beyond any doubt he'd embezzled millions, falsified federal reports, and committed enough fraud to sink not just a company, but a career. I watched the color drain from his face as his eyes darted from page to page. His lips parted slightly, and for the first time in years I saw something I'd forgotten existed in him. Fear. "You took my company," I said quietly. "But I took your freedom." He froze. The smirk was gone now, replaced by something raw and unguarded. His pupils flicked up to meet mine, and behind the polished businessman mask I saw the terrified boy I once carried on my shoulders. The boy who used to think his father could fix anything. "Dad," his voice cracked slightly, "you don't know what you're doing." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing," I said, leaning in. "You thought I'd crumble. You thought I'd drink myself into silence. But while you were out buying suits and feeding lies to the board, I was building something you can't touch." He swallowed hard. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled the papers. He found the page with his digital signature beside a dummy company name. His breath hitched. He flipped to another, an email trail between him and a supplier detailing kickbacks hidden as consulting fees. His jaw locked. "How did you—" he began. "I taught you how to play the game," I interrupted. "But you forgot who built the board." He didn't speak, just sat there silent, his composure unraveling in slow motion. Around us, the restaurant buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, the murmur of life going on, as if the universe itself refused to acknowledge the quiet collapse happening at our table. I let the silence hang. It was heavy, necessary. Then I reached across the table and placed my hand gently on the folder. "This is just a copy," I said. "The originals are in safe hands, lawyers, journalists, federal regulators. The whole package. If I wanted, I could end everything for you tonight." He looked up sharply, and panic blooming behind his eyes. "You wouldn't. You're my father." I smiled sadly. That used to mean something. His face contorted, a flash of rage cutting through the fear. "You think you can threaten me? I own coal industries now. I made it bigger, stronger." "No," I said, my voice calm, steady. "You made it hollow." That stopped him. The words landed harder than I expected. His lips pressed into a thin line. I could almost see the storm inside him. Pride, guilt, defiance, denial, all fighting for space behind his cold exterior. "You don't understand," he muttered finally. "You built a company for another era. I just adapted. That's what survival looks like now." "Survival?" I echoed. "You call theft survival?" "You call betrayal ambition?" I leaned closer, my voice dropping to a whisper. "Son, survival isn't about stepping on others to stay above water. It's about keeping your soul intact when the tide rises." For the first time, he looked away, not in arrogance, in shame. It was brief but real. A flicker. I sat back, exhaled slowly, and said what had been burning inside me for years. "I didn't come here to destroy you, Ethan. I came here to remind you what you destroyed." He blinked, confused. "You think you took my company, but what you really took was the family that built it, the trust that gave it life, the man you used to look up to." He said nothing. "I could ruin you," I continued softly. "I could hand this over to the authorities tomorrow. Watch your name splashed across headlines. Watch your empire burn." A pause. Then I leaned forward one last time. "But I'm giving you one chance, the same mercy you never gave me." His eyes flickered. Disbelief, maybe hope. "What chance?" "To make it right," I said. "Step down publicly, admit what you did. Restore the people you wronged. Or I'll make sure the world sees who you really are." Silence. He sat there motionless. The air between us felt electric, stretched to the breaking point. Then for the briefest moment I saw a tear forming in the corner of his eye. He blinked it away fast, hiding it behind pride. "You'd really do that to your own son?" he whispered. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time I didn't see my son or my heir. I saw a man who had lost himself chasing the illusion of success. A man I failed to teach the one thing that mattered. "I already did," I said quietly. "The moment you betrayed me." He didn't respond. He just sat there frozen, the weight of truth pressing down on him harder than any court ever could. I stood, straightened my jacket, and left enough money on the table to cover the check. As I turned to leave, I felt his eyes on my back. For a brief second, I wanted to look back, to see if there was still something human left in him. But I didn't. Some chapters deserved to end without an encore. Outside, the night was cool. The air smelled like rain and exhaust and freedom, and for the first time in a long, long time. I didn't feel broken, I felt alive. Because the truth wasn't just a weapon anymore, it was justice. And justice, when delivered cold and quiet, can be louder than any revenge. There's a strange sound the world makes when a life built on lies starts to cave in. It isn't thunder or a shout. It's paper folding, keyboards clacking, and the low hum of people who suddenly remember how to do their jobs. It's the click of a phone dialing a number you hoped would never ring. It's the rustle of legal envelopes being opened. That was the soundtrack the week after that dinner. The week everything Ethan had stitched together with quick wins and shortcuts began to unravel. The first knock came in the form of a terse letter, a sealed envelope from a regulator's office. They'd opened an inquiry based on a series of financial anomalies flagged by more than one source. My face went pale when I held it. The letter didn't scream. It was clinical and precise, like a scalpel. It named accounts, transactions, and raised questions about the subsidiaries Ethan had set up. It asked for records. It asked for explanations. It asked for cooperation. Those polite words are the thin paper armor companies wear before the storm. Within 48 hours, the media smelled the rain. The trade newsletter that had run the initial piece expanded into a wider story. A freelance financial reporter connected a few dots and published a longer article. National blogs picked it up. Suddenly, Ethan's flawless image, the polished interviews, the confident photos, the glossy statements about modernizing the company, started to look fragile. Then shaky, then broken. The board, the stack of men and women who had voted me out, had to react. This is the part most people don't see. Once fear sets in, alliances shift like sand. Board members who once smiled across mahogany tables now scrubbed their hands clean of a messy fall. They called emergency meetings. They asked for audits. They demanded transparency in a language they'd flouted weeks earlier. Ethan tried to fight back the way he always had. Press releases, confident statements, aggressive denials. He went on camera with that practiced smile and said everything was fine, that the company was solvent, that the rumors were nothing but attacks from competitors. He fought in public and in private. But the thing about fabricated empires is that they don't hold up under bright light. Paper trails don't have loyalty. They have dates and numbers don't lie. One by one, partners pulled away. The flashy firm that had promised to underwrite a major expansion quietly backed out when they saw the regulator's letter. Suppliers who had been paid with the kind of guarantees that depended on future cash flow suddenly demanded immediate settlement. The offshore middlemen who'd made everything look smooth overnight decided their own risk wasn't worth the alleged reward. Deals unspooled like a spool of thread being pulled too fast, until nothing remained but a messy knot. And then the board did what boards do when newspapers write uncomfortable things. They appointed an independent committee. They froze certain accounts. They placed Ethan on administrative leave pending the outcome of an internal investigation. It was surgical theater, efficient and cold. He'd run the company for months with the speed of a man intoxicated by power. But he'd never learned how to defend a reputation when the tools for defense were the very things he'd subverted. All of this happened in a week. In 7 days, the man who had been grinning across the table at me had his inbox flooded with subpoenas, his phone lit up with messages from lawyers, and his public face started to crack. The Twitter threads, the headline pushes, the late-night analyst segments, it all fed into a drumbeat of pressure that made even his most loyal supporters nervous. Even money, which often buys silence, has limits. He tried to call me during the worst of it. I didn't pick up. Not right away. There's a small cruelty in letting a man sit in the dark with his own fear. I wanted him to feel what it was like to be stripped of certainty. Besides, I had other things to do. Meet with people who had been burned, help arrange forensic accounting, and make sure the facts were organized and preserved. If I'd called him then, he would have used the call as bait, spun charm into a rope. I wasn't giving him that rope. When he finally showed up at my cabin 2 weeks after the storm started, he looked like a man who had been dragged through mud. The suit he wore had no shimmer now. It hung on him like a costume that didn't fit. His hair had lost its stylist's precision. He looked smaller. He sounded smaller. There was no smirk. There was a rawness to him I hadn't seen before. Not the polished executive, not the swaggering son, just a person reduced to the basics. Breath? Heartbeat, regret, Dad, he said, voice thin, shame exposed in a way that made the word feel heavy and historic. For a moment, he didn't add the fancier titles men use when they're trying to convince strangers not to look at their scars. He was talking to me as the father he once knew. I heard the old cadence of family in his tone, and for a heartbeat, The old man in me, the one who'd held him as a child, wanted to let that wash any wounds clean. But there's a difference between wanting and acting. Betrayal had scratched me deep. Wounds are tricky that way. They make you sentimental and suspicious at the same time. He sat at my kitchen table, hands folded. He said things you might expect, apologies that started with, "I didn't mean for," and "I thought I was doing the right thing." There were tears, too. Not cinematic sobs, but real wet remorse leaking out in small human ways. He used words like pressure, expectations, and mistake. He pleaded. He said he'd been overwhelmed and assured me he would fix it. He promised restitution. He wanted my help, not with the public implosion, but with the private aftermath. He wanted me to be the man who could mend reputation with the ease of a family handshake. You can imagine that scene and think of a cinematic reconciliation, father and son hugging in the kitchen, the past forgiven and futures repaired. But real reconciliation has a ledger. Real forgiveness asks for work. Real justice asks for accountability. A man who's broken your trust must still answer for the harm he caused others. I'd watched his empire crumble, and I'd watched people hurt. Contractors who had poured sweat into projects had invoices bouncing. Families whose paychecks were tied to our company faced uncertainty. Employees who had believed in a simple promise, honest work for honest pay, suddenly found that promise stretched thin. So when Ethan lowered his head and whispered, "Dad," it hit differently than any headline could. I saw the human at the center of the mess, and I also saw the ripple of men and women who'd been trampled for his gains. I thought about justice and mercy as separate tools on the same bench. Mercy, wielded without thought, becomes enabling. Justice, applied without compassion, becomes cruelty. I made him a deal, the kind of deal a father might make when he's still a parent but refuses to be naive. It had rules. He would come clean. Publicly. No half-truths, no crafted statements that bent the truth to protect an image. He would meet with the regulators and cooperate with investigators. He would agree to make restitution where possible, to negotiate with vendors in good faith, and to step away from executive control while the company stabilized. In return, I used the credibility and contacts I'd assembled to lobby for leniency in sentencing. I made calls I didn't have to make. I spoke to lawyers who owed me favors. I put my own reputation on the line, quietly, legally, ethically, to keep the focus on remediation, not maximum punishment. There's a reason I did that. Punishing a man into perpetual ruin doesn't repair the damage done to families, employees, and clients. But neither does sweeping crimes under the rug. The goal was repair, not revenge disguised as justice. I wanted him accountable, but I also wanted a path for him to make amends that didn't automatically lead to a caged life, at least not if he followed the rules we set. That's a mercy with teeth, structured, conditional, and aimed at true restitution. He cried when I told him the terms, not because he feared prison most, though he did, but because the weight of being responsible for people he'd hurt finally settled on him. I watched him pick up the phone to call lawyers, to arrange meetings. He hesitated, then looked at me, and for a second I thought of the little boy who once wanted to help oil the trucks. He said, "Dad, thank you." And in some small, unclean corner of my heart, I wanted to throw my arms around him and fix everything. But I didn't. Instead, I walked him through the practicalities. I told him how to apologize publicly. Not a weak statement, but a direct acknowledgement, a named list of wrongs, and a plan for restitution. I insisted he meet with those he'd wronged. He dragged himself to offices and to job sites, and he listened. Not with the practiced penitent of a PR man, but with the bluntness of someone who knew he was on the edge of losing more than a company. He was losing himself. The courts never needed to get involved beyond the investigations. The legal system began its slow work, and because he cooperated, because I'd helped set up a framework where restitution could be part of the response, the prosecutors shifted from punitive to remedial in tone. That's not always how it goes. Sometimes men like him learn nothing and walk away with pockets full of ours. But in this case, the combination of pressure, evidence, and a willingness to repair made a different outcome possible. In the months that followed, Ethan got nowhere near the headlines he once chased. He lost status, certainly. He paid fines. He signed agreements. He worked with auditors and took part in reconciliation meetings. He did what I asked, and he did more than that sometimes. Not out of virtue, but because the consequences were real and immediate and he had no choice. After all that, when the public sirens faded and the company stabilized under a new, honest interim team, he came to me again. This time his voice had aged a decade. He sat across from me with hands that weren't steady, and he said what sons sometimes say and fathers sometimes need to hear. "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't mean to hurt them." He cried then, properly like a man unguarded. The word Dad slid out of him without artifice. I sat there and listened. The ache of betrayal was still a fresh bruise beneath my ribs. There was pain in watching a son suffer, even when his suffering was of his own making. There was a stubborn human part of me that wanted to fold him back into my life like nothing had happened. I helped, but not by restoring him to what he'd been. I helped by making sure he had a path to atone that didn't slam the door on restitution. I used what influence I had to keep the line between accountability and destruction narrow, because one of the lessons hard times teach you is that total annihilation rarely serves anyone. Mercy in that sense was justice's more measured cousin. Then I walked away. Not out of cruelty, but out of preservation. Mercy has limits. There's a point where staying would mean sacrificing my own sense of self, where continuing to protect a man who betrayed me would be a betrayal to everyone else who trusted me once. I'd given him a ladder. I would not climb it for him. Years later, people asked why I didn't press for harsher punishment, why I'd cut deals and called for restraint. I'd tell them then what I tell you now. Vengeance that destroys without repair only repeats the harm. True power is knowing when to bind and when to let go. Letting go isn't weakness. It's the last sharpest edge of mercy. Ethan rebuilt a life that was quieter, humbler, and painfully earned. He learned things you can only learn when you've had the cushion of privilege yanked away. How to meet the people you hurt and look them in the eye. How to earn trust in small increments. How to take responsibility without excuses. It didn't make the betrayal forgiven in my heart. Some wounds scar and remain a reminder. But watching him work for what he broke, rather than hiding behind lawyers and suits, taught me something else. Repentance is a long, slow labor. It isn't dramatic. It's tedious and it's real. When I left him on that autumn morning, the sun was low and the air smelled like a rainstorm on the way. He called me Dad one last time and I answered, because that name is older than the mess between us. But I didn't go back. I had learned the cost of too much faith and I'd paid a price for it. Mercy had been sharp and precise, enough to carve out restitution, not enough to erase the past. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not to make them suffer more, but to hold fast to yourself, to demand accountability, and to walk away with your dignity intact. That's what I did. That's what justice tempered by mercy can look like. I didn't go back to coal industries. Not once. People kept asking me if I wanted the company back, if I'd sue, reclaim my title, rebuild the empire I'd once led. But truth is, I didn't need to. I'd already built something far greater than steel, glass, and profit margins. I built a name, and no one, not even my own blood, could take that away. For months after the collapse, I lived quiet. Woke up before sunrise, brewed my coffee on that old gas stove in the cabin, and just sat. I'd watch the sun crawl up over the tree line, listen to the birds come alive, and let the silence do what words couldn't. Heal. It wasn't easy. Healing never is. I had to relearn who I was without the business suit, the boardroom, or the title of CEO. I had to face that man in the mirror, not the one who'd lost everything, but the one who'd survived it. And slowly, piece by piece, I began to rebuild, not my company, but my purpose. A few months later, I got a call from an old colleague, Dan Walker, one of the first men who'd ever worked for me. He said, "Rich, there's a bunch of young folks out here trying to start their own thing. They've got heart, but no direction. Maybe you could come talk to them." At first, I laughed it off. Me, a mentor? I wasn't sure I had anything left to give. But something in me said go. So I did. I walked into that little co-working space, nothing fancy, just a couple of desks, buzzing lights, and kids with dreams bigger than their wallets. And for the first time in years, I felt alive. They reminded me of myself in '87, running deliveries in a beat-up pickup, fueled by nothing but coffee and hope. They listened. Really listened. I told them stories about mistakes, lessons, and how trust and loyalty matter more than any deal. I warned them how greed can wear a friendly face, and how you should always guard your values tighter than your bank account. Before long, mentoring became my new calling. I wasn't chasing power anymore. I was shaping the next generation to be better than I was. Smarter, kinder, and grounded in something real. Sometimes I'd drive by the city, just to see coal industries from a distance. The logo was still there, gleaming in the sunlight, but it didn't sting like it used to. That chapter was closed. I learned something powerful through all of this. Legacy isn't about a name on a building or the number in your bank account. Legacy is about the people who carry a part of your story forward, the ones who remember how you made them feel. And if that's true, then maybe my legacy isn't coal industries at all. Maybe it's those young dreamers who now run their own companies with integrity. Maybe it's the father who learned how to forgive, even when forgiveness felt impossible. Ethan. Well, he's still trying to rebuild his life. He started small again. A few consulting gigs, some local investments. He's humbled now, quieter. Every now and then he calls. Sometimes it's just to check in, sometimes to ask for advice. I can hear the regret in his voice, the kind that doesn't fade with time. I don't hate him anymore. I don't think I ever truly did. I hated what he became, what greed turned him into. But deep down, I still see that kid who used to fall asleep on my lap in the office, holding a wrench and pretending to fix machines. I guess that's what being a father means, carrying love and pain in the same hand. Now, when people ask if I got revenge, I tell them the truth. No, I didn't destroy my son. I destroyed the part of me that needed revenge because in the end, revenge might bring satisfaction. But forgiveness brings peace. And peace. That's something I'd been chasing my whole life without even knowing it. I look at the world now. Quieter. Simpler, more honest, and I realize something. Sometimes, losing everything is the only way to find yourself again. So here I am, Richard Cole, 63 years old. A man who once had everything, lost it all, and came out cleaner on the other side. And if you've ever been betrayed, if someone you loved turned their back on you, I want you to remember this. You can rise again. You can rebuild, not the life you had, but the life you deserve, because sometimes the best revenge is living with peace in your heart and no bitterness left in your soul. If you've made it this far, then maybe you felt it too. That ache in your chest when someone you love looks you in the eye and betrays your trust. It's a pain that cuts deeper than any wound, because it doesn't bleed on the outside. It sits in your heart and it whispers to you at night, you should have known better. And maybe you're sitting there angry. Maybe you want to get even. Maybe you want them to feel the same emptiness they left you with. I get it. Believe me, I get it, but take it from me. Revenge doesn't heal you. It changes you. When Ethan turned his back on me, I thought my life was over. I thought every ounce of love, loyalty, and pride I'd ever poured into that boy was wasted. But the truth? It wasn't. Because through the pain, I learned who I really was and who I refused to become. See, revenge isn't about destroying someone else. It's about reclaiming yourself. I didn't ruin Ethan's life. I didn't have to. He did that on his own. All I did was show him the mirror, let him see the man he'd become. The greed, the arrogance, the lies. And in that reflection, he saw something far worse than punishment. He saw the truth, and that truth, it broke him, but it also set me free. Because real peace doesn't come from payback. It comes from letting go. When I walked away from coal industries for the last time, I wasn't just leaving a company behind. I was leaving behind the man I used to be. The one who thought success was everything. The one who measured worth by wealth. Now, I measure life by simpler things, the sound of birds at dawn, the smell of coffee on a cold morning, the look on a young entrepreneur's face when they finally believe they can make it. Those are the things that matter. Those are the things betrayal can't take from you. If you're out there, right now, broken, betrayed, maybe even blaming yourself, listen to this old man for a second. You can lose everything. Your job, your money, your friends, even your family. But as long as you hold on to your integrity, you're still rich, because integrity is the one thing no one can steal. They can lie about you, cheat you, turn others against you, but they can't touch what's inside. That's your gold. That's your power. And when you rebuild from that, you don't rebuild weaker, you rebuild wiser. You know, sometimes I still think about Ethan, not with anger anymore, But with hope, I hope he finds his way. I hope he learns that success without character is just noise. Maybe someday, he'll understand that what I gave him, the lessons, the love, the name, was worth more than all the money he ever chased. But whether he does or doesn't, that's not my burden anymore. That's his story to write, mine's already written. So if you take anything from this, let it be this simple truth. The people who betray you might break your heart, but they can't break your spirit unless you let them. The world may knock you down, but every time you stand up again with your dignity intact, you win, not them. You. Because the greatest revenge isn't making them pay. It's walking away with your head high, your hands clean and your soul at peace. I've learned that forgiveness isn't weakness when it's strength. It doesn't mean forgetting what they did. It means refusing to let it poison what's left of you, and maybe, just maybe, that's what this whole journey was about. Not revenge, not redemption, but peace. So here I am, Richard Cole, a man who lost his fortune, his family, his pride, but found his peace. If my story tells you anything, let it remind you that every ending, no matter how painful, is just the start of something new. Because when you stop living for payback and start living with purpose, you don't just survive betrayal, you rise above it, and that, my friend, is the real victory.